Good morning, everyone. I'm Corey Guker, coordinator for the Northern Rockies Fire Science Network. And on behalf of our team and our partners, I want to welcome you to today's webinar. It is Fundamental Research on How Wildfires Spread. It will be presented by Sara McAllister. She's a research mechanical engineer for the Forest Service at the Missoula Fire Sciences Laboratory in Missoula. But before introducing our presenter, I want to run through just a couple of webinar housekeeping items. You, as an attendee, are in listen-only mode for this webinar, but feel free to ask questions of me or for our presenter by typing them into the chat window or questions pane of the control panel. We will wait and field these questions at the end. Unless of course we don't get a whole lot of more attendees, and then maybe we can unmute, but we'll just plan on having me field the questions with Sara at the end. Whatever you do in your control panel won't affect the presentation, so feel free to type a test message or test your audio at any time. We will record this webinar and it will be available on the Northern Rockies Fire Science Network website and our YouTube channel soon after the conclusion. With that, I'll move on to introducing our presenter, Sara McAllister. Sara came to the Missoula Fire Lab soon after getting her PhD in mechanical engineering from the University of California, Berkeley in 2008. Sara's current research interests include solid fuel ignition, live wildland fuel flammability, burning rates of porous fuel beds, and material flammability in reduced pressure and space exploration environments. When not exploring the physics of fire, Sara is running, cycling, and competing in triathlons. Welcome, Sara. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you. I guess I'll just get started. So I do not work in a vacuum. I work with a lot of other great people, including Mark Finney, Jack Cohen, Jason Forthover, and Torben Grubstrup, and we're sort of the principal scientists doing this work. But nothing would ever get done without a lot of other help from a lot of other great guys and gals like John Bergroos, Josh Deering, Andrew Goris, Isaac Renfell, Randy Pyrocki, Sophie Vernholm, and Kyle Wold. So, as Corey said, I work at the Missoula Fire Lab, and the Missoula Fire Lab is part of the Fire, Fuel, and Smoke Science program, which is one of 8 research programs in the Rocky Mountain Research Station. There's a lot of other great research going on in the Rocky Mountain Research Station, like air, water, and aquatic environments, stuff like grassland, shrubland, and desert ecosystems. But the Fire, Fuel, and Smoke Science program is what I'm going to be talking about. It's where I work. And we're broken up into 6 focus areas. The physical fire processes, which is the group I'm involved in, but we do pretty much every other aspect of fire behavior or fire research, including fuel dynamics, smoke emissions and dispersions, fire ecology, fire and fuel management strategies. And we have groups of people that work on actually pulling all of this research together, synthesizing it, and putting it into a form that actually is useful for everybody. I am also part of something called the National Fire Decision Support Center, which is a collaborative effort between fire and aviation management and research and development. The idea is to do research on stuff like fire economics and fire spread research to improve the scientific basis for large fire decision making so that we can develop and improve fire management decision support tools and processes, and finally to be able to improve agency capability and make and implement well in fire decisions. Primary goal really is firefighter safety, but there's really a threefold purpose in looking at fire behavior and doing research. As I said, provide better training and education to improve firefighter safety. We want to be able to provide explanations that correspond with experience to understand what people are seeing and why. Also to provide better planning and mitigation tools so that we can understand and implement opportunities for preempted wildfire effects. To be able to provide a scientific basis for why some fuel treatments will work better than others in certain places and how and why to do them. And also, as you would expect, to provide better prediction operationally, particularly for large fires, and to be able to provide decisions support for management alternatives. For example, when to just step back and not do full suppression, and when it's safe to do so. So there are a lot of limitations on our current system. As probably you are aware, only about 1% of our wildfires actually get modeled, and those are the ones that escape initial attack, right? And we use a lot of different operation fire models like Behave Plus, Farsight, FS Pro, WFDIS, but and others, but they all are really based on the same underlying fire behavior models. So for surface fire spread, that's the Rothermel model developed in 1972. So a little bit of history of the model is that it's a semi-empirical model based on wind tunnel burns, which means he had a general equation of an energy balance, but there are a lot of terms within that equation that he had to use experiments to create the coefficients for. And those experiments were all done in a wind tunnel, not out in the field. The model also assumes that the fire is steady state and in a homogeneous dead fuel, meaning that the fire is already spreading at a constant rate and it only was developed for uniform fuels. So his experiments that he did were only in pine needle beds or in the stuff called Excelsior, which is just shredded wood. So in order to use it for the more heterogeneous fuels, the different sizes of fuels, and to include live fuels, the model uses a modification proposed by Albini, which I basically call a voodoo weighting scheme for fuel loading, because it was not ever actually verified with actual fire spread experiments. So the transition between surface and crown fires was the models use a model developed by Van Wagner in 1977. So Van Wagner's model is based on 8 experimental and wildland fires data points in one fuel type. And that model basically predicts that torching will occur if the surface intensity attains a critical value, which is based on the crown base height and full ignition energy. So again, I will emphasize that it is based on only 8 experimental data points, not exactly a wide range of data. And our active crown fire spread rate model, again, is one by Rothermel that is purely an empirical correlation based on 8 data points from 7 wildland fires. So what Rothermel did was basically knew where the fire was at a given location at a given time on the hillside, and where it was at some other point later at a given time, and just used that to come up with an average spread rate. Again, he only had 8 of those data points. And the model that we have actually only considers wind-driven crown fires, because the plume-dominated fires actually didn't fit into his correlation, so we actually just threw them out. So the crown fire rate of spread model basically just takes the surface fire spread rate and multiplies it by 3.3 to get the crown fire rate of spread. So in a nutshell, our operational models use purely empirical or semi-empirical relations that are often based on just handfuls of data. But they have been very useful in the past, but they're not necessarily right. And we have research models like computational fluid dynamics models that still make plenty of assumptions, but they also take way too long to run, and many fire managers are not trained to use them. For example, I have a PhD in mechanical engineering, and I don't honestly know enough about a lot of these models to be able to run them myself. So that's also a challenge. So because we have all these limitations in our current systems, we have a lot of unanswered questions. We don't have models to help us understand why do fires spread faster when the wind blows, why do fires spread faster uphill, under what conditions does a fire transition from a surface fire to a crown fire, and why do live fuels burn at moisture contents above 100%, but dead fuels won't above 10 to 15%? Why do some species burn as crown fires and others don't? Take, for example, lodgepole pine versus aspen or larch that often don't want to burn. And finally, why do some prescribed fires only burn on sunny days and not on cloudy days, all else being held constant? So part of this is that we really just don't understand the physics of how it works. So Andrew Sullivan, a guy out of Australia, wrote a review paper a few years back looking at all of the physical and quasi-physical models in a literature that he could find from 1990 to 2007. And he found 19 different models and had stated that the identification and formulation of the processes involved in the behavior of wildland fire is problematic. So this basically just means that if we actually understood the physics, there would really only be one model, not 19 of them. And part of this problem is that is a physical problem where the relevant spatial scales span 6 to 7 orders of magnitude, which basically means we have to know what's going on at the pine needle scale of only about a 1 millimeter in order to understand what's going on the landscape scale, at the kilometer scale, or even larger, which is very challenging. So our group's overall research goal is to be able to get at exactly how fire spreads so that we can build a physically based, computationally efficient fire spread model that can be used in an operational environment and that alleviates many of the limitations and the inaccuracies of the current models. So in order to do that, we have to kind of break the problem down into its components. So if we really take a look at how fire spreads, it really is a series of ignitions. Some fuel ignites, it burns, it releases energy. Some of that energy gets transferred as heat into the unburnt fuel ahead of it, which then ignites, and then the process repeats. So it's a coupled system between ignition, energy release, and heat transfer as a function of ignition, but the context of each component is critical. So you can't just understand ignition without understanding the energy release or the heat transfer. So our group is breaking it down into the different components within the context of the whole, and trying to understand the bits at a time. So the first bit that I'm going to talk about is work that we're doing to understand how heat is transferred in a wildland fire. So much of what we know about fire has come from the structural fire protection engineering field. This is a much more mature field, relatively speaking. It involves fires in the built environment, like home fires, structure fires, pools of flammable gases, stuff like that. But what's different about wildland fires, or what's unique about structure fires, is that the fuels are large surfaces. They're walls, they're furniture, they're pools of gasoline, things like that, which is very different in context to the wildland fire. I mean, our fuels, the stuff that burns in the flaming fire front, are very fine. They're the pine needles. They're only about 1 millimeter in diameter. Very different from a big wall or a couch. They're discrete particles. They're widely separated by gaps of air. They're spread out. They're clumpy. And they're often living vegetation, which is very different than, you know, your desk or your couch. It lives and it grows and it, you know, essentially breathes, and that is going to change the context of the problem. So the first question is, so how do these fuel particles ignite? Is it by radiation, which is what we've always assumed? It is the primary mechanism in structure fires. It is the primary mechanism what we feel when we see it stand next to a fire. So we've always assumed that that is what ignites our little pine needles in a wildland fire. But if we take some different fuel types and do just a little experiment. So if we take a clump of Excelsior, which is this shredded wood stuff, and I'll get my little spotlight here, and compare that to what happens when we stick a block of wood in front of a radiant heater, we'll see some very different things. I can't advance slides with my pointer. So if you stick a block of wood in front of a radiant heat source, you would see in about 35 seconds that you can ignite it. However, that clump of Excelsior, even after 5 minutes, is still sitting there. It's barely even charred. It won't ignite. In fact, you can stick clumps of grass in front of a radiant heat panel and nothing will happen. It'll just sit there. So what's going on here? So if you were to put a thermocouple on the surface of that wood block and measure its temperature as it heats up, looking at that red line, we're looking at a bigger block here, you could see that the temperature of the block, the 12 millimeter or half-inch particle, if you will, heats up, and it eventually jumps in temperature at around the 30-second mark there and ignites. Whereas the blue line, which represents our finer fuel particle, doesn't seem to heat up at all. It doesn't even reach 200 degrees Celsius, which is sort of like a minimum temperature in order to even char material, let alone ignite. So what is happening here? Well, it turns out that the radiant heating from these fine fuels is easily offset by natural convection. For in this case, and that convective cooling can even be through forced convection, through wind. So if you were to take a look at, say, your radiator in your car engine, or the back of your refrigerator, or your inside of your computer, you would see that we often build heat exchangers with very thin fins, and that those thin fins are really good at convective cooling. So we basically have trees made out of cooling fins. So they are really efficient at offsetting and the radiant heat from the flame. And incidentally, they could also be heated very efficiently from convection as well. So how do fuel particles ignite? It's not radiation, it's not conduction, because our fuel particles are separated by air, so you can't conduct heat along them. So it has to be convection. It's that flame contact, because it's really the only mechanism that's left. So this has always been overlooked, and you can see from these diagrams of how people draw flames of perhaps the reasons why, right? We always imagine flames as being very hot, so they want to stand straight up. So how could a really hot flame possibly move forward and down into an unburnt fuel bed? So the questions are, what is the mechanism of forward convection, and what can keep a hot flame down? So in order to answer that, we turn to some experiments. And the fuels that we would commonly use in laboratory fire spread experiments are really not well controlled for particle to bed level and uniformity. If you look at Excelsior or pine needles, you're always going to have some clumps left. So you don't know if what you're seeing is a result of the clumpiness of the fuel or if it's really a characterization of what's going on. So we needed a fuel that's well known, repeatable, uniform, and controllable. So we built fuel beds, as you can see in the background there, out of something that looks like, or we call a cardboard comb. There's a base board of cardboard. It's like the back of your notebook paper. Kind of a thicker cardboard, but still pretty flexible, with tines that we can stick up. And so we cut these cardboard combs using a laser cutter, and then we can build all sorts of different fuel beds. So these are our fuel beds that we've put in a wind tunnel. We've done 62 of these burns so far with a pretty wide variety of fuels. We've got some tall, thin stuff, some shorter, thicker stuff, stuff that's more closely spaced or further spaced apart. We've varied the wind speed and looked at what has happened. So we also have a tilting bed so we can look at the effect of slope, because that's also important. So we're just starting work on this, and we've done about 22 fires so far with a varying slope degree from 15 to 40 degrees. And I'm going to show some video of what we saw during these tests. So I'm just going to play it and kind of talk through a little bit of what's going on. So this is just one of our tests, and we're looking from the top down, and the flame is propagating sort of from the bottom of the screen to the top of the screen. And you can see, even though it's pretty turbulent and chaotic, there are some distinct patterns to what's going on in the flow. You can see that there are some sort of peaks and troughs forming in the tops of the flames, but also pockets of gases that are forming and bursting into the fuel bed. So again, we're looking top down, and it's going from the right to the left. And you can see, pockets in the flames that are kind of very intermittent. But it's really fascinating to watch. And everything you see here is due to the fire spread process itself, right? Because we've got a very uniform bed. So nothing is a result of the way the fuel is distributed. So here you can see some pretty distinct peaks in the flames and troughs in between them. And some bursting down in the troughs that actually seems like where the flame is moving forward into the fuel bed. So just looking at some snapshots here, it becomes a lot more clear, these peaks and trough patterns. So here's just two photographs, and those peaks and troughs can vary a little bit. So if you've got really tall flames, you might have fewer peaks and fewer troughs, versus if you've got really short flames, you might have more peaks and troughs. But since we started seeing these in the lab, we started seeing them absolutely everywhere we looked. It was kind of one of those, once we got the light bulb, we're like, oh my god, it's everywhere. So here are just some photographs of just some grass fires all over the world, including some in Germany, where you see again these peaks and trough patterns in the flames. We saw them in a crib fire burn that we did out at the lab. I'll talk more about cribs, but they're basically like wood pallets, but a little bit more uniform. But again, we saw the peaks and the troughs in the flames here as well. Also saw them in some photographs of some ground fire experiments that were done in the Northwest Territories. So we're seeing them everywhere. And it turns out they scale pretty well. As I mentioned, you get bigger flames, the distance between the peaks seems to increase. And so we are actually able to see this over a pretty wide range of scales. So This graph shows the wavelength, or the distance between the peaks of those flames, versus the flame length. So again, the bigger the flames, the bigger the distance between the peaks. And that's scaled all the way from our wind tunnel burns up to, you know, the few points that we have in the larger outside fires. And what's happening while these peaks form are because of streamwise vortex pairs. So this schematic just shows that there's these natural streamwise vortex pairs. They're called what we think are called Gertler vortices, but they exist in every kind of flow over a surface. But you don't typically see them because you have no way of marking them. But in a flame, the pairs of the vortex, when they come together, will push the flame down, forming the trough. But where they pull apart, or they would come apart, it pulls the flame up into the peaks. So you're able to actually see these naturally occurring vortex pairs. And that's what gives the flame its distinctive peak and trough pattern. We also get, as we saw in the videos, these pockets of gases that get kind of carried away along with the wind to push the gases in the troughs forward and into the fuel bed. So just to emphasize this video shows some flow tracking that we've done with one of the fuel beds. So this is with the flame spreading at us. But if you look in between the peaks, you can see some circular motions from where those vortex pairs are pushing the flame down. And also you can see down in that trough, we'll play it again, that forward bursting of the flame. So these are the mechanisms of how you keep a hot flame down into the fuel bed. So as you can imagine, the heating from these flames is not a consistent flame, not a consistent heating. You get these pockets that burst forward intermittently, and if you were to stick thermocouples in the propagating flame, you can see that there's quite a bit of intermittent heating before the flame actually gets there, and you see these pulses of temperature, high temperature gases before that flaming front actually gets there. And if you zoom in on these thermocouple traces and looking at the gas temperature, you can see that they're actually fairly regular in their frequency. They're almost like a pretty consistent pulse. So if you do a signal analysis and do one of these fancy engineering things where we plot these non-dimensional numbers, you can see that it covers a pretty wide range of sizes of fuel. So this is a graph looking at the Struhal number versus the Froude number. So the Struhal number characterizes that frequency of the pulsation, and the Froude number is kind of a characterization of the size of the fire. So you're looking at a wind velocity and a flame length in the Froude number. So you can see it scales over a pretty wide range of fires. We've got some gas burners that we've done in a wind tunnel all the way up to the Alaskan Crown Fire data point, and it all seems to follow sort of the same trend, which is really promising, meaning that we can study these big fire phenomena inside the lab and actually kind of grasp some of the stuff that's going on. So that was all stuff in wind, and so I said we've been dabbling with slope burns. So this is just a video of what we see on a slope burn, and you see many of the same features in the flame. You see those same disks of gas forming downstream and convecting upward, same sort of peaks and troughs there as well. So we're working on the analysis on that some more, but that's all great and dandy, but the question is what do these flame bursts actually do to the fuel particles? Do the fuels actually care that you're bursting of these flames? So what we've done is we've stuck a couple of fuel particles inside of the fuel bed that we've instrumented. So we've got two different sizes, a bigger particle and a thinner particle, that we put thermocouples in all four sides so we can measure the surface temperature. That big cylindrical thing right there is measuring the radiant heat that they experience, and we also have thermocouples up in the air to catch those bursts of flames. So if you were to look at the data that we get from one of these experiments, this is what it would look like. It's kind of a busy graph, but the red line is the line of that radiant heat flux that we see approaching the particles. So you can see it's a pretty steady increase as it goes up. But the blue line is the gas temperature. So that's catching the pulses of the air. And the black line is the temperature of the actual particle. So the temperature of the actual particle in the initial stages up to about 100 seconds seems to sort of follow the red line. So it's responding a little bit to the radiant heat flux. But if you zoom in toward the end, toward ignition, which is what the figure on the right shows, you can see that it's much more sensitive to what's going on in the blue line. So every time the gas or the flame pulses hot air at that fuel particle, its temperature jumps. And it really stair-steps its way up to ignition based on what's going on with the air temperature. So our small temperature rise is due to that radiant heating. And we get a lot of cooling, primarily from convection, while it's radiantly heating up. And those heat fluxes are actually really too low to even heat up a large particle. And we see a very distinct stair-step heating by intermittent flame contact on the thinner, fine fuels, again, that are going to be primarily involved in a wildland fire. So that is a taste of some of the work that we're working on in terms of understanding the heat transfer. The next piece of the puzzle is what's going on with ignition. So because of our work with heat transfer, we know that the ignition is going to be due to convective heating. But unfortunately, most of what we know about ignition is due to radiant heating. So we need to understand whether or not it's a different process or if there's anything different between convective versus radiative ignition. And also start to answer the question of what's going on with live fuels. So to look at convective ignition, we had to build an apparatus which basically consists of two glorified hair dryers that we call air torches. They're electric heaters. They're 6.5 kilowatt powered per torch. They're connected with a manifold so that we get an outlet out the top. We have some flow straighteners in there, and we can control the mass flow rate and the temperature that comes out. So we can control the speed and the temperature of the air that we're heating our particle with. And so this is what one of those tests look like. The white block there is the outlet of our manifold. You'll see a circular hole on the inside, and that's where the hot air is coming out. And so just a simple experiment here, looking at how just a simple little wooden dowel ignites. So we just slide it into the hot air, we wait a second, and then it will ignite. So the way we're understanding this is by using an infrared camera. So this is what screenshots of the ignition process looks like for that rod at a low air temperature. We're looking at 600 degrees Celsius or about 1100 Fahrenheit at what happens as that particle ignites. So for the lower air temperature for that rod, you can see, based by those little blue blobs, that it ignites upstream and the flame propagates back down toward the solid, which is a little bit different than what happens if you increase the air temperature. So this is the same rod, and you can see that it ignites much more closely to the sample when then it propagates back toward the tip. Interestingly, this is very different for something more like a disc shape, more like a leaf. So instead of showing the process of ignition here, I show a grid of different diameters of discs at different air temperatures. But you can see that they all ignite pretty much at the same place, right behind the solid. And so the way the flow goes around the solid really changes the ignition process. So if you get something blunt like a leaf where the flow has to recirculate, you trap the gases back behind it, or something more rod-like or like a pine needle, the gases are able to flow around it a little bit more, so it ignites in a different spot. But interestingly, if we use just a very relatively simple analytical model, we can actually predict the ignition times regardless of what the fuel looks like and the air temperature. So this graph just shows our predicted ignition times versus our measured ignition times, with the black line being the perfect fit. You can see in most cases we actually do a pretty good job of predicting the ignition time with a very simple model. So this is very promising, particularly if the air temperature is hot enough, which in a real wildland fire with real flames, we're well expected to be in that higher temperature regime. So that's great, because we can explain, something, the ignition time of just a simple wooden dowel. But what about live fuels like our pine needles? Can we treat them simply as wet wood like we've always done? All of our models really just, since we don't know any better, just treat live fuels as simply wet wood. So here I've shown just some data of what the ignition time looks like as a function of moisture content for wet wood. As you'd expect, the higher the moisture content, the more water, the longer it takes to ignite. So is that the case with live fuels? So to get at that understanding, we've done some experiments with 10 different species of live fuels. I'll step through sort of in groups of species at a time of what we saw. So here you're looking at ignition time and moisture content. And I'll note that the moisture content that we measured was due to natural variations. So we sampled these fuels once a month for an entire year. So the moisture content variation was due to weather patterns, growing seasons, all of that. It was not manipulated by us at all. So looking at these 4 species, we have chamise, sagebrush, lodgepole pine, and gamble oak. Chamise being a component of chaparral, sagebrush and gamble oak are from Utah, lodgepole pine are from Montana, and of those 4, only the sagebrush actually shows that expected trend with the ignition time and moisture content. The others are really pretty scattered and show no real pattern. Same thing with the next group of species. We've got manzanita and ceanothus, which are also chaparral species, and sand pine from Florida. And what's interesting is if you look at the manzanita and ceanothus, there actually would be a nice linear increase, except for those 2 points over there, which, interestingly, are the 2 new points of new leaves. So those were tests that were done in the spring when the new leaves had just come out, and they burn in a very different way than the older leaves, which is fascinating and kind of nerve-wracking at the same time because we can't understand this. Our last group of species here, we're looking at Douglas fir, which is the blue, and that actually shows the expected trend to increase your ignition time with moisture content. But these 2 others here, featherbush and gallberry, which are shrubs from Florida, actually show the opposite trend. So the wetter they are, the faster they ignite, which is just really a very interesting problem. So to maybe understand a little bit of what's going on with some of these, I'm going to show a video of what a featherbush leaf looks like when it heats up at using a high-speed camera. So this is looking at it with about 1,000 frames per second. Get to play my video. There we go. It's 1,000 frames per second. So we're heating up a featherbush leaf. And you can see there's some bubbling going on kind of near the stem, but the real action here starts in just a second. So that kind of behavior, that exploding, doesn't happen with wood or with dead needles or dead leaves. So something is very different about live fuels. We can't treat them as simply thin pieces of wet wood, and there's several reasons why. So there's a big structural reason, like we saw with that last video. They're living cells. They have a totally different way of holding water. They hold them inside the cells like little balloons. They pop like popcorn, and that's very different from a dead fuel. And they're chemically different as well, particularly from wood, because they're living and breathing, they're photosynthesizing, they're generating what I call non-structural carbohydrates, like sugars and starches that the plant needs to live and to grow. And it's generating them, storing them, and then moving them throughout the plant depending on where it is during the growing season. There's fats and there's proteins in these leaves and needles. And depending on whether or not the plant holds onto their needles or leaves for more than a season, there's varying amounts of stuff like lignin that's going to really affect the way it degrades. And it also asks the question of just what the actual moisture content means anyway for a live fuel. So moisture content is typically defined as the mass of water divided by the dry mass of the fuel. But if you're a living needle and you're constantly storing and generating and transporting sugars and starches, you may change your dry mass very regularly without ever changing the moisture content, which means that or the amount of water, which means the moisture content can change without any change in the amount of water in the leaf. So we need a new way of describing our live fuels so that we can actually be able to predict their ignition and burning behavior and kind of characterize what's going on. So that's a taste of what we're doing with the ignition work, and that brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, which is the combustion and energy release part. So this comes down to quantifying the burning rate and the residence time. So the burning rate residence time will help us quantify the flame zone depth and the fire line intensity, which will kind of help us with the fluid dynamics and the heat transfer in the flame, help us with the peaks and the troughs. We got to better understand the flame spread rate. It also gives us a residence time for what we call the shot clock. So if you have clumpy fuel like we have in this grass in the picture here, if that one clump of grass burns for a finite amount of time, but you know it takes a certain amount of time for the next clump of grass to ignite, if those two don't match, your fire won't spread. So you have to have one clump burning for longer than the ignition time in order to have a fire spread event. So understanding this residence time will help us understand when and where a fire will spread and when it won't. It also provides an insight into fire effects. Residence time is and how long the heat is in one spot is important for understanding tree mortality. So our current methods of doing this in our operational models is simply by stating that the residence time is equal to 8 times the diameter. So it's just a simple number that we throw in, but doesn't take into effect any of the other environmental factors that we know will affect the residence time. So to get a better handle on it, like what we did with the spreading fires, we're turning to very repeatable and regular fuel beds to understand that. And we're using something called wood cribs, which are shown in the picture here. And they're regularly used in fire protection engineering as heat sources for their fires. And you might wonder like why we're using them, because wildland fuels are not as predictably arranged. They don't look at all like a tree or a fuel bed, but again, it's getting back to that fundamental understanding of what governs the physics. The physics that govern the process will help us understand something that's much more complicated. And in essence, a wildland fuel is similar to a crib in that it's individual fuel elements that are separated by some distance. That may be a small and uniform distance, like in a needle litter layer, or it could be larger with a non-uniform distance like what you find in a tree or a shrub. But again, it's that same physical processes that we're trying to understand that will govern the burning in both the crib and a wildland fuel. So what we know from the literature is that there's sort of two regimes to how these fuel beds burn. So if it's really dense, if the sticks are really close together, you can say that the fuel bed is densely packed. So as you start to spread those sticks apart, as you start to increase its porosity, it's going to breathe better. The more oxygen is going to be available to burn, and you're going to increase your burning rate as you increase your porosity up to a certain point. Then it becomes loosely packed. So any increases, and loosely packed and efficiently ventilated. So any further increase in the porosity or the amount of air you get inside that fuel bed is not going to change the burning rate anymore. And that burning rate is going to be dominated by the sort of the individual fuel particles itself. So this is the theory from the literature on crib burns, but it was built, with a very limited set of conditions in mind, because they were mostly using them for their testing purposes. So we've built a ton of cribs that look very different, and to see if this sort of explanation holds. And it does for the most part, except for the dots that I've highlighted here, kind of fall off of the prediction capability of this model, which is unfortunate because these are the fuels, these are the cribs that more likely represent what's going on in a wildland fuel. So these are the cribs that I built with very, very small fuels on the order of a 1/16 of an inch, or about 1 millimeter particle. So they're much more of the size of a pine needle. And you can see that they burn at a different rate than what that one particular theory predicts. But if we take our data and look at it in a different way, we actually can do a lot better. And instead of looking at it in terms of the way they define porosity, which is somewhat related to a bulk density, we can come up with a much better prediction for how a fuel bed will burn. And the important factor here is including the height of the fuel bed. It turns out that that's a really important factor in predicting a fuel bed burning rate. Another important factor is how far off of the ground it is. So we've done some tests where we took identical cribs and held them up off the ground at varying heights. So these 4 pictures here show the same crib directly on the ground, like in the top left, and then all the way up at 3 inches off of the ground, which is the bottom right. And you can see that there's a pretty big difference in the way they burn, whether or not it can get air from underneath. So it turns out that there is a critical distance that a fuel bed has to be off of the ground in order for the height to not be an effect. So it turns out that 1 to 2 inches is about that critical distance. So stuff that's burning up in the canopy seems to not be seems to all the height won't matter. So if you're talking about a 2-foot shrub versus a 10-foot or a clump of fuel that's 2 feet off of the ground versus a clump of fuel that's 8 feet off of the ground, it will still burn with the same burning rate. Stuff directly on the ground will be burning at a much reduced burning rate. In some cases, it was about like a 90% reduction in the burning rate, depending on sort of the fuel bed layout. One of the other factors that we're looking at is the effect of wind. So we've stuck these cribs in a wind tunnel and looked at how their burning rate changes with wind. And you can see some similar patterns to say what a tree looks like in wind. You can get the vortices that kind of wrap around the back, just like in a tree. And the effect that wind has is also kind of dependent on how that fuel bed is shaped. So if the fuel bed is relatively short compared to the thickness of the elements that are in it, so we're looking at L over B of a small number, so L being fuel bed width, B being the fuel thickness, adding wind to it increases the burning rate. But if your fuels are very thin or your fuel bed very wide, adding wind might actually decrease the burning rate. And you can see why in these pictures here. So the top photographs show what happens when the burning rate increases. You can see that the whole fuel bed is burning pretty thoroughly, whereas these other photographs down here show what happens when it decreases. You actually get a region in the interior of the fuel bed that actually just doesn't get the oxygen in order to burn, so it doesn't burn as uniformly and reduces the burning rate. So there's a lot of future work to be done with this. We're looking at the difference between slope and wind to see if that changes the way the heat is transferred and the way we predict the heat transfer. We're working with a couple of different universities to further investigate those flame structures and look at the convective heat transfer, particularly looking at temperature and velocity distributions of those flame pulsations, the location of the flame under varying conditions, just knowing simply where the flame is, flame attachment, particularly when you're looking at slopes and how that changes the way things burn. And as we saw, that intermittent heating is how things actually ignite, but we don't really understand if the intermittent heating has a different process than the constant heating in the ignition. Also, we're still trying to wrap our heads around what's going on with live fuels. Another little thing that we're looking at is what is exactly different between big fires and small fires. So when you get big fires, you get these really, really tall plumes that hover above them that act in some ways like a chimney, that they reduce the amount of air that can actually penetrate into the plume, which might actually feed back into the way things burn on the ground. That air has to come from somewhere, so it may be ventilating the fire itself better and perhaps changing the burning rate of things compared to when it's a much smaller fire and you can get more wind penetrating in there. We also have a guy who's looking at the way fire spread up a slope. So he does this really cool technique called shadow graphs and Schlieren. And so what you're looking at here is one of those shadow graph analyses of a fire spreading up a slope, and where you can really see that the plume is actually offset from where the flame zone is. So it's actually pulling the flames back toward the solid, and you're getting that flame attachment up the hill, which is going to change the fire spread up a hill dramatically. And eventually all of this is going to go, like I said, into a new fire spread model. So one of our guys is working on just a sample research model right now where he's just looking at a one-dimensional spread where he populates each little element with different sized particles and looks at how it spreads. But what's neat is that he can actually test some of those fire spread threshold behaviors with his little model. So that's where we're headed with all of that. So I think that is all I have to say, and I think I will open it up for questions.
Thank you, Sara. That was probably the best physics lesson I've ever sat through. Um, let's see, no one's typed in any questions, but I'll start out and see if anybody types anything in. And you can, again, type into the question pane or the chat pane. I'll monitor both. So in one of your earlier slides, you said that only 1% of fires are modeled.
Yep.
And so I guess I'm curious, I mean, you showed us you did a good job of describing why these artificial fuel beds, because you can repeat the studies and learn more from them, are kind of the preferred method for learning some of these physics basics that we didn't understand. But are you trying to model more wildland fires and learning from the natural fires as well?
So we have plans to do a lot of prescribed burns and instrument our field work, so that we can get at some of that scaling and make sure, like I said, what we're doing at the lab scale applies to the real world. We have some data points for the larger fires, but they're few and far between, and we'd like to fill in those gaps. And prescribed burns is a fairly straightforward way for us to do that. So we do have work to do that. And I'm not sure if I clarified that why only 1% of fires are modeled, and that's just because those are the fires that escape initial attack and become these large, long-burning fires. So it actually takes, several days to staff up and actually get people out there to actually model it, right? But we're hoping that by having a much more physics-based model that we can help in some of the planning stages in order to be able to plan fuel treatments better, for example, and do better training.
So if you had no shortage of funding and personnel, what do you see as the future? Like how long is it going to take for you to really understand all you want to know about wildland fire behavior?
Ooh, that's a tough question because, so the fire protection engineering field has been really active in trying to understand structure fires for about the last 100 years, and they still have a lot of unanswered questions themselves. And they have had almost endless funding and almost endless people working on the problem. To fully understand absolutely everything in wildland fire is several lifetimes worth of work. But hopefully even in just the next couple of years, we'll understand enough to where we can start making progress in answering some of our unanswered questions.
Okay, well, I haven't gotten any more questions, but as I indicated in the chat, we'll have this recording available. There's also Sarah's contact information on that webpage, so you can contact her later if something comes up. And I just want to thank you again, Sarah, this was just a great presentation.
My pleasure.
Thanks for joining us, everyone, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.